Um, so it's my great pleasure to welcome today's masterclass guest, and that's Colin Glass, or for those of you of a northern disposition, Colin Glass, OBE. Michelle hates it when I do these northern jokes. Yeah, I can just see a cringe.
Definitely Glass, yeah.
Indeed, indeed. Most of you will remember Colin from last week. Colin is Richard Munoz's colleague. The pair of them moved over from WGN to Murray Harcourt a little while ago. Some of you will have had the pleasure and benefit of experiencing Colin's advice, guidance, and contacts. I know that Rachel, Mother, and Alex have for sure. And for those of you who haven't, then there's plenty of opportunity left in the last 3 weeks of the program. Colin has been a huge supporter of this program. Colin was also a supporter of a program that we bid for last year in the Leeds City region, and unfortunately came second. Not that I'm remotely bitter, but he would have been a brilliant partner in that. Colin is, I think it's fair to say, one of life's givers, which I mean in the nicest possible sense, in that every time I've asked Colin for some advice, some guidance, or to give one of our beneficiaries some advice or guidance, he's without hesitation said yes. Which is unusual for an accountant, because the usual response for an accountant is, hang on, let me just set the clock running, which is a little bit of a slur on his profession, but he will understand where I'm coming from. So Colin, welcome. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your support of the program. Do you want to start by talking us through your early background? I mean, you started your own accountancy business, which is unusual. So what got you to that point in time?
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for listening in, and thanks for the invitation. Yeah, I'll whiz through the background. First of all, you need to know that I'm very obsessive and very competitive, and that sort of comes through. It's worked for me and it's worked against me in my fairly long career now. But in the late 60s, believe it or not, in the late 60s, my very close friend, who's still my business partner, Melvin Winburn, got me interested in the stock market, mainly what was called then stagging new issues. Very quickly, what that was, that when companies became public, it's all changed now, they had to put an advert in the Financial Times, and with a little form that you could apply for shares for, and because of demand and supply, if the demand was high, the shares would go up almost immediately. And we watched this for some time, and there were all the big names in those days. People like Tesco were going public, and many others. And true enough, this is what happened. And I thought, well, what a fantastic way to make money with very little risk. And then we tried it after watching what happened. And the first share we went for, the shares went down. I can always remember the name of the company, Oxley Engineering. However, we weren't deterred. And because I'm obsessive, I got very, very interested in the whole area of stock market investment. But I had no money. And at that time, I was qualifying to be an accountant. My colleague Melvin, I think, had already qualified. He was very bright. And we set up a little partnership to do share dealing because the tax system was different, but ignorance was bliss in those days. However, we even borrowed a bit of money to do it in this partnership. We both had jobs. As I say, we were both qualifying to be accountants. And then we realized that it wasn't as easy as it looked. And I was very interested in investment. And so it was deregulated then generally. So we started giving advice to our friends of friends on a commission basis. But we weren't going to sell our soul for commission because it was interesting and they were friends. And we were very transparent about it. And so we had this little investment advisory business backing up our share dealing. Then I qualified, and I was so interested in the stock market. And at that time, the guru was a guy called Jim Slater, and he had a company called Slater Walker Securities. And what he did was he found sleepy public companies where the assets were greater than the share price, and he would either knock on their door, metaphorically speaking, and say, look, I can revamp your company. The share price will go up and we'll all benefit. And I want a stake in this company. Some of them, because they were sort of old-fashioned family companies, didn't want to know, but others did. And from this, he created, if you ever got time to look him up, he's dead now, but Jim Slater created this whole era of entrepreneurialism, of people trying to buy into the stock market. And I was so fascinated by this. And then I saw a lookalike business that opened in Leeds called PR Grimshaw & Co. Investment Bank, doing the same sort of thing, but locally. And there was a job, I just qualified then, and I was working in the profession, but I saw a job advertised with him and in the centre of Leeds, and I went for it. And it wasn't the job that I actually wanted, it was more the accounting side. But when I got in there, I then was asked to sort of look at the other side of the business, which was looking into these companies to find ones that were good for investing in. And that's what happened for 3 years, and it was like sort of my job and my hobby. But then I woke up and realized the politics of the office, and he was bringing in his friends, and I could see that even though I was, in one sense, his right-hand man, I was never going to get on the board. It was only a small company, and it was great to work for, and I learned a lot, and I was very sad to leave. But by this time, Melvin had sort of was very well thought of in the profession. He'd gone through a bigger company, and then he went into industry. So between us, we were getting a lot of experience. And after a year, when I worked for another small public company after leaving Grimshaw's, we both decided, first of all, that Melvin would jump and set up a practice, an accountancy practice, because we were both chartered accountants. And in those days, it had some kudos. Nowadays, it doesn't, but to be a chartered accountant. And so we thought, you know, we'll call ourselves an accountancy practice. But I never really wanted to be in practice. What I wanted to do was to be another Jim Slater with no money. So either way, we set up. And also in those days, accountants and lawyers were not allowed to advertise. And so if you advertised or marketed yourself openly, then you could actually be struck off. I mean, it's all changed overnight some years later, thank goodness. So we had to rely on telling people what we were doing and hoping people would say, oh yeah, you know, I need a new accountant, or yes, I'll come to you. Well, that didn't happen very often, because established businesses, even though I knew quite a lot of people, they were a bit frightened of changing to an unknown firm. However, as I say, my interest was not in the direct line of accountancy. But I said to Melvin, I said, look, what we want to do is, we know many, but we can give advice. And what we should do is risk our fees and take a small equity stake in the business. Okay. And he said, well, you know, how are we going to live? I said, well, we'll cobble together. We'll have some clients that, you know, ordinary clients that can pay. But if we can find these startups that need this advice but can't afford to pay, then we can get into this. Well, you know, he went along with it. And we then decided, because we were operating from our one major client, who subsequently became one of the largest retailers, clothing retailers in Leeds. In those days it was called Man for All Seasons. But he'd opened in a shop in a new shopping centre in Crossgates, the Arndale Centre, and he very kindly gave us an office above his premises. And he was very good, a guy called Tony Reynolds, fantastic guy, introducing us to people. But then we decided that we needed to be independent. And so we found a little office in Lidgett Lane in North Leeds. It was a shop front, so we could have our building society agency, so we couldn't advertise. And behind it, we had the accountancy. So, and then we brought in a third guy called David Norfolk, who was another accountant that Melvin knew, who thought we were both mad the way we were going about, but he wanted to throw his lot in with us. Hence, Winburn, Glass, Norfolk.
I was going to come to that.
I wish I had a pound for every time people say, "Oh, are you a glass company from Norfolk?" Or "What are you doing here from Norfolk?" Oh God! But so later on, we changed it to WGN in line with KPMG, EY, and PwC and all that. But however, so we set off Wimbledon Glass Norfolk, and we headhunted because both Melvin and David had worked for Spicer and Pegler in those days, a secretary who was with us from then for God knows 40 odd years, I think, or more, Christine. And so the four of us, we were so proud of our little premises. However, coming back to the main thrust is the fact that we picked up one or two clients, and I can't believe it was 1975, and that was the year I got married, and I can't believe, looking back, that I decided to get married just when we were starting the business from scratch. However, we got enough
big commitments.
Live on. There are all sorts of stories to go along with this, but it would take too long to tell you, but off we went. But the key thing that happened then, we were introduced by a friend of mine to a guy that was a research assistant at Leeds University, a modest job. He was married with 2 young kids, lived in a semi-detached house in Headingley, and we went for a drink, and I said, well, he said, I've got an idea for a business. So I said, yeah, well, tell me about it. He said, well, I'm a radio ham. And he said, I have designed a piece of equipment. Remember, this was 1974 or 5. The world has changed. And he said, it's called an RF clipper, and it does this. I said, stop. I said, I don't really, what are you going to do with this? He said, well, I can sell it to other radio hams, which was a sort of group of people who had this fantastic hobby of talking to each other all over the world on amateur radio. So I said, okay, how are you going to sell it? He said, this was before the internet, there are specialist magazines, we can sell it through these magazines, sort of mail order. I said, fine. How much do you think you need? So he said, about £1,000. I said, okay, we can get you £1,000 to get this business off the ground. He still had his day job, and he set off in his back bedroom, and he was brilliant, but he didn't need £1,000 because as soon as he made some, we were selling them. So the money started coming in. I don't know how much they cost in those days, maybe £35, £40, and all the rest of it. But it enabled me to enjoy this Walter Mitty existence of being, in inverted commas, the finance director of this tiny startup. And it was great fun, but very serious fun. And I advised him as he went along. And the business grew to the point where he said, look, Colin, I can't, the postman wonders what the hell's going on here every day, you know, collecting all this, delivering all these letters with checks in and all the rest of it. He says, I need to give up my day job. So I said, look, you've got I still was single then. I said, you've got a wife, mortgage, all that. No. He says, I'm confident now. So we moved into a small factory unit, and he carried on from there. And that business grew over the years. And what happened, because he was a brilliant designer, he came across some equipment that was of interest to the Ministry of Defence. I can tell you all this now because it was many years ago. And they sort of arrived on our doorstep and said, look, we're interested in this. It was in covert tracking. Well, technology's moved on now, and tracking is, you know, is a big business in many different ways. But in those days, particularly covert tracking, where, you know, you could track somebody without them knowing. And the department in the Ministry of Defence sort of promoted us in a way throughout Europe, and the business grew and grew and grew. Now, along the way, this model started, and we took a small stake in the company. I think it was 10% when it was a startup with nothing to show. And I said, look, don't come back to me when we sell out for £1 million. In those days, £1 million was a lot of money. And I said, we will have £100,000 because we had 10%. And I says, don't worry about that. We'll worry about that when it happens. And so off we went, and I'll come back to that story, how it ended. But then people got to know that we were prepared to do this, and other people had approached us. And we got involved in a number of companies over the years. Most of them weren't going to go anywhere despite our best efforts, but a few of them, with, I might say, our help, did go all the way, and so either exited and we all made a nice profit, or floated on the stock market. Because during this time I got involved at long last in the stock market, in the AIM market. There were all sorts of stories, and became quite well known for what we were doing, our model, which was still very unusual. So that's how it worked. And each one is a story in itself. But just to finish off with this company, which was called Dayton Electronics, in the end, and I'll keep it quick, we got an offer from a major merchant bank, and it was a great story. I never believed it was true, and we went down to London, and they wined and dined us, and my colleague David didn't even want to go. And then I realized, for a bizarre reason, they wanted to buy us, and they bought us at a nice profit. Not enough for me to retire because we only had 10%, but David managed to retire, and that proved it. But so that model we've used, and we built the practice around it, helping companies with a hands-on approach to our work.
So, in one story, you've been accountant, entrepreneur, investor, sweat equity investor, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Walter Mitty, with a kind of flavour of James Bond.
Yeah, that's very good. I like that.
Well, you can have this. It's being recorded. So, a genuine question then. So I didn't know any of that story, and one of my questions was going to be, where did WGN come from? So I now know that. Do you think you are the first? Were you the first people you knew who'd taken sweat equity?
In those days, I think so. I mean, obviously, I wasn't as well networked as I am now, so I don't know. But the ecosystem now has changed dramatically. I know we've only a limited amount of time, but anybody who wants to know, it is amazing what goes on now and taken for granted. Even the things we're doing now, the investor readiness courses and all this, never heard of. I mean, accountancy was such an old-fashioned profession, and words like corporate finance were just coming in, and we didn't like to call ourselves things like that. But once the AIM market and the USM before then, because before that, it was the stock market, and it was a club, and that was it. But then at least they started to realize that smaller companies needed to raise funds on the stock market. So they started this unlisted securities market, which was followed up by AIM and blah, blah, blah. But then out of that, successive governments realized, and we'll come to this, I'm sure, later on, that smaller companies and startups were happening more and more. And therefore, they needed to find ways of helping all sorts of, including tax breaks as well, over the years, ending up with the EIS and SEIS now.
So your first investment in inverted commas was actually not cash. It was time and know-how.
Yeah. Well, yes.
Although a true sweat equity investment.
Yeah. Well, we always subscribe. So as the company was £20, and we had we had put £2 in.
You paid your nominal stake because you'd be good accountant.
On a tax point, we don't say that our that's the colloquialism, sweat equity, but it's very important from a tax point of view that we roll up our fees, which is a euphemism for write them off eventually. But genuinely, we hope that if everything goes well, we'll start to get a fee, which we do, obviously for the work that we do, and also that in a few cases we recoup some fees of the ones that we've rolled up. But we'll call it sweat equity. It's not just to compensate us for taking the risk of doing this, and many of them don't come off, but we genuinely believe we can add value and improve it. So that's the key thing.
Okay, so your kind of primary memory of that time Would you say you were accountant first, entrepreneur first, or investor first?
I think once you're trained to be an accountant, you think like an accountant. But if you're entrepreneurial, you have to be prepared to take risk. And we were prepared, and I was particularly prepared to take risk, but only up to a certain percentage, which is why we modeled it like this. I have every admiration for all the people who are starting in business, and that's why we wanted to help them, because we can add value. But equally, they're entitled to the 90%, we're entitled to the 10%, obviously. But we're pedaling hard to make our 10% worth a lot, and therefore that helps their 90%. And it's all about building that relationship of mutual trust. That's the whole issue of getting it forward.
Okay, so with the benefit of hindsight, so we're now we're 50 odd years-ish, years later. What do you wish you knew then that you know now about business, about setting up in business? You must have made mistakes.
Yeah, I think so. It's all about people. This whole theme is about people, and I wish that we would have employed better people over the years, and given them larger incentives. I mean, eventually we did. For instance, we took in other partners, but it took us a long while to realise that their value should be rewarded, but incentivised by making them partners. But it is quite a complicated issue because everybody has a different personality and different requirements. But that's, I think, when I look back on that.
And how so you use the word partner in a formal sense. In an informal sense, how valuable was your partnership with Melvin? I mean, it was interesting. So we saw him pop in on Richard's presentation last week. So 50 plus years later, you're obviously still good friends. How valuable was that? How valuable was the informality of that partnership? Having somebody you could bounce ideas off.
It was absolutely fantastic because he's completely opposite from me. He was attention to detail, where I just wanted to get it moving, and then I wanted somebody to sweep up after me, which David Norfolk used to do very well. But also to have someone who you can trust totally, who's your partner. And believe me, many partnerships, for that, particularly professional partnerships, it's littered lawyers and accountants. Over the years, it's just endemic. Therefore, that we are an exception, really. And we've gone on. That's not to say we don't fight like cat and dog, but somebody who can be trusted, who's side by side with you, is very, very important.
So Melvin left when WGN moved?
No, Melvin's still with. Unfortunately, he has Parkinson's, but it is under control. So he's still working and he's still with me. David Norfolk retired 7 years ago, but he had a completely different personality, and he was ready to retire. He didn't get involved in any of the hurly-burly that that we've been involved with, in particular myself. But we had a great relationship for 40 years, and then had two other partners, Jane Tyndall, who was brilliant, who was with us over 25 years, and she retired, which started the whole, and a guy called Rod Stubley, who was our technical guy. But that started the whole process of looking for succession and eventually merger.
Yeah. So without being indelicate, if 1969-ish was the kind of year of setup, that's, by my simple maths, 51 years ago.
Yeah.
Why haven't you retired?
Well, because I just love what I'm doing, much to my wife's chagrin, I think. But I just like the challenge. I like helping businesses and seeing them succeed. But as I say, because I'm obsessive and competitive, it's got me where I've got today. But equally, I would say got me into trouble. But you know what I mean? It's you can go down some paths which you shouldn't go down. My very good friend Ajaz Ahmed, who was one of the founders of FreeServe, has got me to put on my phone, you must say, I can't remember, say no.
Right.
Say,
Well, don't. I mean, in terms of this group, don't say no, because
no, I enjoy it.
as I said in the intro.
The people I've spoken to, Rachel and Alex, not met them yet, obviously, but it's been very interesting, and I've quite enjoyed it.
So you've got no intention of stopping?
No, but I mean, the merger is very important because it's freed me up. I mean, running, as people will know, running a business with all is multifaceted, and particularly dealing with staff. We didn't have a lot of staff, but it is quite demanding, and the economics change as well. So I'm quite happy with the merger. We found a firm that was with the same sort of ethos that we had, but our arrangement is that they've freed me up to do what I want to do, if you like.
Okay. And that's showing no sign of diminishing. You're still motivated to get out of bed in the morning?
Amazingly, in these 2.5 months of lockdown, the days have just whizzed by. And if you ask me what I do, there's just so many different things happen that make it interesting. And stories abound. People from the past come to you, and you've still got clients. I'm still on the board of 2 or 3 companies, so I've got to keep involved there. No, it's interesting.
Okay, so this morning's session, both the bit, or the second half of the bit I did, and the bit that Charlotte from North Invested was around equity investment. What floats your boat? What determines what you invest, either your money and/or your time in?
Well, I think I was going to say people. That's the main thing. Is who's behind the business. Can you get on with them? Can you build a relationship with them? But it's really, I would say, 3 P's: people, presentation, and that means the project or the proposition and the potential in the marketplace, and then the prospects from that. How can this business grow? Can we help it grow by our advice and also our contacts? Because over the years, we've made a lot of contacts, and I pride myself on that. And to be able to pick up the phone to someone at all sorts of levels is very, very important. I was on the board of this was fantastic for me. I was on the board of the British Business Bank, which is in the news at the moment because it's running on behalf of the government all these schemes. I was on there for 3 years in its early years. Really fortunate to be invited to join the board as non-exec. I learned a lot. It's a completely different world. But they've just appointed an interim CEO.
Yes, they have. A female.
Catherine, yeah. Well, I was on the board when she joined, and she's absolutely delightful and also amazingly, she's very experienced and a really good person. So, I just dropped her a line to congratulate her and said, we must get together, and she agreed. And if I go down there, last time they'd moved offices, I went in, and it's just fantastic at that level. And then at all different levels, somebody I'm trying to help, they're in the retailing side, so I know somebody fairly high up who was a CEO of a public company, and he's a good friend. And I said, will you talk to them? And he said, of course, and so forth and so on. You just never know where it leads. It's all about contacts, right? Which is why networking is so important in building relationships.
Absolutely, and it echoes a point that we made in this morning's session, that actually the best investors aren't just the ones with the cash. The best investors are the ones who've got the little black book and the contact and the experience. Sorry, go on.
No, sorry. As important, obviously, as cash is, sometimes it's dangerous to give people the money without the control or the advice that goes with it, because there's been some notable cases of people, particularly in the dot-com boom. They got hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds, and blew it away on cars and premises and goodness knows what in a matter of months. And it is very, very important. Yeah.
Absolutely. I was starting to recite the story this morning, but we ran out of time. I had a client years ago who appeared on Dragon's Den. She was a cooking Mexican food sauce that she started making in her back bedroom in Belper in Derbyshire. And she'd started, typical cottage industry, and had got a really good product and got really, really good customer feedback, but she was struggling to get into the high street multiples. And when she got rejected through Dragon's Den, we used that PR to attract business angel investment. And I forget the exact company, but the guy that we got to invest, and it was a relatively small amount of money, but he invested, but he also introduced her to the CEO, I think he was, of John Lewis Partnership. And lo and behold, within a couple of weeks, her products were on the shelves of Waitrose. And you wouldn't have been able to do that just by spending money. It would have taken you 2 years to go through taste tests and all sorts. So yes, it's the advice, and Rachel Mather has very helpfully put in there, advice is priceless. I'm assuming she means yours, not, but actually it's the contacts and the connections, and it's the maintenance of those networks that's really, really powerful, and it leverages everybody's investment then. So what else? What else do you look for apart from people? Are there any particular sectors that float you about?
Not really. I'm sector agnostic. But once you get into one company, it sometimes leads you into another. And so in the healthcare, and particularly medical devices, I got involved in a startup in the early days of laparoscopic surgeries, keyhole surgery, with a eminent surgeon and a fantastic sales guy who knew exactly where he was going to sell this new product that came up. And we literally started, there was an instrument maker who'd been with Thackeray's, the medical instrument thing, and he was ready to retire from the Leeds University medical physics department. Eminent surgeon, my guy, the sales guy, myself and another, and we started it off, I think, with £1,000, and it's now quoted on the AIM market, a company called Surgical Innovations. And in those days, it was, keyhole surgery was in its infancy. And it was very interesting at the time, and there's some amazing stories, amazing people you met. Because of that, I sort of got invited later on to join Medilink on the board. I'm on the board of a company called Brandon Medical that does great company instruments equipment for operating theatres, so I've got quite interested in that area, that whole area, but as I say, generally sector agnostic.
Okay, so networks are really important to you, and I couldn't recall the amount of times when I've spoken to people in Yorkshire, business people in Yorkshire and the public sector, and they said, "Oh, you need to talk to Colin. You need to talk to Colin. You know everybody." Would you say
not quite, but
not far off it? Would you say your part of West Yorkshire is better connected, better networked than other parts of the country? Because I've worked in the Southeast, I've worked in the West Midlands. I've not experienced that level of connectivity that we kind of see in the Leeds Bradford region.
Well, it's true. Well, I'm Leeds born and bred, and it's a compact. It's obviously Leeds. I'm a very proud Loiner, as they say, and a proud Yorkshireman. And Leeds as a city has grown tremendously, and it's had some good people. And at the moment, we've got some good people running it, both at executive level with Tom Reardon and Judith Blake, who's and Roger Marsh. And so you've got good leaders at the moment, and it is a compact city. Physically, it's compact, especially where our office is now, having spent 30 odd years on the outskirts of town, I didn't realize what I was missing when we moved into the center of town. And, you know, just moving around, you just bump into people all the time. And that is a help. Obviously, networking groups have it's become all the rage in the last few years. And it's become a business almost. And there's a guy in Manchester who's like the guru called Will Kintish. And he's an accountant himself, a great character. And there are others who are starting up networking groups. But it might get overdone now. And at the end of the day, it is building relationships. It's not selling. That's the worst thing you can do. You got to build up relationships and get to know people, and then hopefully they will come to you, and you can provide either a service or goods or whatever, you know.
Okay, that's a very helpful piece of advice. So, which brings me to my I guess my penultimate question. What's the one piece of advice? What's the one golden nugget you would give to the audience today?
Well, it's interesting because when we were talking it through, I think you said, "What are the tips?" So yeah. I've got a few. Can I say more? Can I say more? But the one golden nugget. Well, I would say this, wouldn't I? I would say get yourself a trusted advisor or a mentor with the appropriate background and experience. But I would say that. But genuinely, and there are some really good people out there. I've got some fantastic friends, you know, who are in the same scene, that they've got the experience, they like helping small companies, and they can. But unfortunately now people, some people starting in business, they get inundated with people who say they can help them, and some can and some can't. But if you go to too many, or if you scatter around, you're not going to get the benefit. And what I say is, look, you have a trusted advisor, and you should then funnel things through him. So if the people that I'm mentoring or I'm advising, if they come across somebody and say, look, I met so-and-so, it's odds on that I will know them. Most of them can help, and others, there might be the odd one or two, I'll say, well, you know, it's not for you, and that's it. So I think that is the most important. The other things that are important when you're going into business, you've got to be passionate about your business. You've got to have a sort of 24/7 mentality, unfortunately, or fortunately, if you're that way inclined. You've got to be thinking about it all the time. Other things you got, especially in this era, you've got to be prepared to pivot, you know, if there's a serious change affecting your business. And sadly, with this pandemic, a lot of people have had to do that. And also as a result of that, you've really got to be resilient and determined to take it challenges, to overcome problems. You know, you just can't let things go. You've got to really fight to the end. And then closer to home, if you like, strict financial control is absolutely essential. Again, I would say that, but it is true. Yep. And you've got to have it at a level appropriate to the size and structure of the business. So you don't want to go in too heavy, but all the time you've got to know, especially cash. Cash is king, as they say, and it still is. Cash flows are very, very important. Profit is secondary. You know, businesses don't go bust because they don't make profit. They go bust because they run out of cash. And I think maintaining the cash flow is very, very important. I mean, I think Richard Munoz had some good slides on this when he made his presentation. And obviously make sure, and this morning I'm sure you've spoken about this, and it's a subject on its own, so make sure you have sufficient and appropriate funding to go forward, and take advantage of what the government, I've never seen anything like it, how quickly. I think that's because the Chancellor is, you know, in the finance world, that they brought in the civils and the bounce back loans, the furloughing, the grants. I mean, they brought them in very, very quickly. You've got to understand them, but you've got to take advantage of them when you can. Other things, just a couple more, you've got to understand your margins. That's very important. When you're pricing your goods, you've got to understand the principle of marginal costing and profit. So you don't go in blind. If you're going to give somebody a discount or do a deal, you need exactly where it stands. Control your overheads, and don't if you're starting up, do not spend your money on cars and premises unless you can definitely afford it. And above all, sales. Without getting the sales, the rest is irrelevant, really.
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo the advice on cash. One of the greatest inventions of the modern time is that. Not a picture of my children. No, the mobile phone and internet banking. I have to say, I am religious. First thing I do every morning is I'll log on to the internet banking and see what cash we've got in the business. See who's paid us and see who we've paid. So I've got a really good idea of what goes alive. So we've got a question from Alex, who I know you've met virtually, and it's more a question about your personal goals and ambitions. So do you have any fixed goals on what you want to achieve over the next 3 to 5 years, or is it going to be opportunistic?
Alex, I think at my age, I think it's got to be opportunistic. And to be honest, I don't know if my wife's listening or not. I want to spend more time with her in the last 2 months than I have in the last 20 years, I think. No, and to be honest, I do want to spend more time with my grandchildren who are down in London. I can't see them at the moment, but I just can't resist sort of, if I'm approached at whatever level, trying to get involved. It's not all altruistic, because if there's an opportunity, mainly with some of the bigger deals, then maybe you can make some money. I mean, I got involved in PPE. It's a crazy market. It's a long story, but the first bit I was doing somebody a favor, and I've done a lot of favors just by joining people up. But hopefully we'll get something out of it. But that's not the prime consideration, because you're building up contacts, and it's very, very important, in terms of, quite frankly, saving lives and what's going on. So yeah, it's more opportunistic from now. Although with Alex, I think I want to go to the place in Spain to have a week off.
Have a retreat.
The retreat.
Yeah, she won't let you take your mobile phone. She's harsh.
No, that's the only thing. I told her, I said that I couldn't possibly go.
Yeah, she's a harsh woman. So final question from me, and we're just about on time, which is great. Is there anything that these guys should do differently as a result of COVID-19? So one of the benefits, if that's the right word, of lockdown is it's given all of them breathing space. It's given them all an opportunity to kind of reset their goals and objectives, or in some cases to develop some goals and objectives. But is there anything else that they should be doing post COVID-19, or as a result of COVID-19, as a piece of wisdom?
Well, things happen in one's life that you don't think of, but of course, for almost everybody, this is just something that nobody could even think of. I mean, I was involved in one business in the agricultural side. It made boluses for cattle, and you think of all things that could go wrong, but I never thought of foot and mouth disease. It had happened once, in my lifetime, years ago, and had no connection. But when foot and mouth came up, that was pretty horrendous, but it was controlled within a certain area. Here, it's universal. And I think going back, one practical thing that all businesses are going to have to look at the health and safety planning in different ways, by legislation and just to stop the virus spreading or restarting. But also there'll be things like deciding whether people who've been working at home want to continue working at home. That's going to be something to be thinking about. And then, unfortunately, and I know with some companies that I'm involved in, they're really evaluating the number of employees they've got. And although they've furloughed some are going to be made redundant, which in turn, apart from the upset and the deprivation that's going to cause at all levels, will also I think, spawn new businesses starting in that sense, as often happens in recessions and things like this. And as I said before, you've got to ensure that you've taken or are taking advantage of all the government initiatives, the loans and everything. Look at your marketing. I think you've got to have a cold hard look at whether you are doing it, enough of it, efficiently enough, or you could do without some of it. I think social media has come into its own. The Zoom meetings, there's no substitute for face-to-face. That's a whole subject on its own, the discussion. But Zoom meetings have been very good, and particularly the educational ones or the discussion ones I've found are very good. And then finally, and I would say, you've got to take advice from the right sources.
Brilliant. Excellent. I've just got one final question, and this is something I didn't know, but Rav's shared it on the group chat. It says, Colin is also a keen runner. So,
yes.
So do you have some personal goals? He put, great to see you supporting the Northern Max, but I kind of misread that because I've got my contact lenses in. So as if to say, it would be great seeing you do the Great Northern Run.
It's old hat now. Yeah, as I said, and it's a good way to end because it's where I started. I am obsessive and I am competitive, but I'm not built athletically, and I had to work very, very hard. I played rugby for 25 years or more.
League or union?
Rugby union. I'm very small, but I played as hooker with a fantastic team in terms of the people there. Friends for Life, called Old Modernians, which was the old boys team, now called Leeds Modernians. I have some fantastic stories. I was fortunate, didn't get too many injuries, and I played week in. I would not miss a week at all. And I played for an old man's team after that for a while, another story. But then a client who became a friend, who was also a bit obsessive, got me into running. And he was going to run a marathon, the Leeds Marathon. So I thought I was reasonably fit and I would do that. Then I realized what it was like running a marathon. And I did it in about 4 or 5 hours, but I was determined to do better. And I really got into it to the level I could. And at my height, the height of it, I managed to run the London Marathon in, I think, 1986 in 3 hours, 16 minutes, which was, as I say, better than having sex, I think. That was it. But I've run about 13 marathons. I've run one around Lake Tiberias in Israel, run in Dublin. I've run the Great North Run a number of times. The only problem there is a one-way run, so logistically it's always difficult. And I'm still running. In fact, I do know slightly Alistair Brownlee, and funnily enough, last night and the night before last, I was out for a run, and he rode past me on his bike, stopped to have a chat, well, slowed down to have a chat. I think he's injured at the moment, but I said I'm not going running with him, that's for sure.
Brilliant. I think that's a tremendous anecdote upon which to finish. Yeah, look, Claudette's in the chat, but no more questions. Rachel Rhodes has run it twice and she's never going to do it again.
Right. Okay.
Really interesting having a chat. Thanks again for your support for these guys.
Thank you.
But also for the support for us. You've been a great kind of advocate of ours in the Yorkshire region. So thank you for that from me and from Michelle. Thanks from your mentees, but also those who were able to dip in. And Colin has said it to me before, but I'll say it again publicly. If any of you who don't formally have Colin as a mentor want a connection with him, got a question for him, want to hook up with him, want to milk his network, dare I say, please do so. I'll get you the contact details through me. I'm more than happy to introduce you. Colin, thanks once again.
My pleasure.
It must be time for you to go for a little jog now. It's near 2:30.